Hi, this is Andrew Reinhard. I'm the Director of eLearning for Bolchazy-Carducci Publishers, and with me today, I've got author Ed DeHoratius, who's written 3 interactive fiction titles under the series title of Follow Your Fates. The first book that'll be released is going to come out on June 23rd, and is called The Wrath of Achilles. Now, Ed, how did the Follow Your Fates series begin, and what inspired you to write these books?
The Follow Your Fates series comes from really 2 places. I teach a medieval literature course, and my seniors, rather than take a final exam, do a final project. One year, one of my seniors asked if she could do a choose-your-own-adventure project on the Black Plague, and I told her she could. And when she presented it to the class, we all kind of read it, did it, and it was a lot of fun. We learned about the plague. We enjoyed kind of the format, the interactivity of it all, and everybody thought it was a blast. I should add, too, that since it was the plague, she wrote it such that there was no happy ending. You basically died in every scenario. Then, a few years ago, I taught a classical literature course and was rereading the Iliad after a while, and I thought it might be a fun way to review it and to make sure I read it closely, to write it up in this format. So I sort of took her model, applied it to the Iliad, read through, and mapped out all the different choices. And that's kind of where it came from. I piloted it with a couple classes of juniors, and they really enjoyed it. And so I decided to pursue it further.
I'm glad you did. That really sounds like fun. Why did you happen to choose the interactive fiction format to tell these classic stories?
I've seen retellings of the stories, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, written for younger audiences, middle school audiences, things like that. And I didn't find them terribly engaging. I suppose they're great for the kid that already likes this material, that's already been introduced to Rome and Greece and the ancient world. But I wanted something that was going to reach a wider audience and was going to pull them in a way that they weren't going to find elsewhere. And I think the interactive fiction format really does that by putting the reader in the driver's seat of the story. It gives them a way to interact with the story they wouldn't have otherwise. I think more important, too, is the opportunity that the reader gets to reflect on their own decisions. The idea that they get to think about why they chose what they chose and why perhaps someone in the ancient world chose what they chose, and then to compare those 2 decision-making processes.
What's your goal in having this trilogy published, and who are you trying to reach?
My goal in publishing the series is really to introduce as wide an audience as possible to the classics of ancient Greece and Rome. These are texts and stories that I grew up loving and I now love teaching, and I want to share that with other people. And I think the interactive format is a good way to access as wide an audience as possible. The interactivity of it allows people to feel involved in the story and really makes it a different reading experience than a more traditional format for telling the stories.
I see. How close are your stories to those original epics of the Iliad, Odyssey, and the Aeneid?
The goal of the Follow Your Fate series is to introduce readers to the stories of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. And so they stay fairly faithfully to the original storylines of the epics. There are some parts of the Follow Your Fate series that go outside the scope of the epics. For instance, in the Iliad, we see Achilles before he goes to the Trojan War, which the Iliad doesn't cover. But one of the main purposes is to introduce readers to these stories themselves, not to gloss them over in any way, not to change them in any way, but to allow them to approach, hopefully in the future, the originals with some knowledge of what's going to happen and what the narrative will cover.
Right. Now, taking some of the artistic license with addressing the Aeneid, what would you say your favorite part was about writing Wrath of Achilles, and what do you think was the most difficult?
The Wrath of Achilles, in many ways, was the easiest to write of the 3. I found when writing them that the emotional choices that characters made were much easier to write alternate endings for than the active decisions that a character made. So, for instance, it was much easier to write an alternate ending if the choice was Achilles gets angry versus Achilles keeps his cool, versus Aeneas stays in one place but or moves on to another place. The physical choices were harder to write alternate endings for. I enjoyed coming up with the alternate endings. It was a fun exercise in creative fiction. The existence of an original narrative limited me enough that I couldn't make up anything I wanted, but of course I still had to come up with fictional endings. The hardest part, I think, was keeping those fictional endings fresh, coming up with different ones and plausible ones that the reader would believe or could believe, but that still, of course, didn't actually happen in the original.
Oh, I see. As Achilles, can you really decide not to fight the Trojans? And if not, what happens then?
It certainly would be difficult to envision Achilles not going to fight the Trojans, but I think that original choice that he makes, where his mother Thetis presents him with the option of not going to Troy, in many ways encapsulates the entire importance of approaching the material in this way. For the ancient world, there was always a choice, even if it wasn't necessarily a good one or an easy one. And I think the more difficult the choices that are made, the more effective this interactive format is for retelling these narratives. So that, yes, it's sort of like an action hero in an action movie who's in trouble in the first 15 minutes. You know he's not going to die. In many ways, you know the correct choice when Achilles has to decide whether to go to Troy or not. But by the same token, it's important to realize that he did have a choice and that he did choose to go to Troy and made that choice based on cultural values and, of course, personal interest.
Once your takes on the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid are released, all three titles are out, do you have other ideas for additional books in the series?
The series really lends itself to any number of directions to go in. I think if I were to do more after the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, I'd think about some of the other myths of the ancient world. I'd really like to look into, I guess what you could call diptychs, pairs of stories. So I think Agamemnon, working off the Iliad, the Wrath of Achilles, would be an interesting character to pursue, but then along with that, to tell the same story or a similar story from his wife's perspective, from Clytemnestra's perspective. So to sort of have an Agamemnon version and then a Clytemnestra version, each of them making different choices, but of course their narratives overlapping. Getting beyond the epics, to some extent, moves away from focusing on a single text. But I think that these stories are well known enough and important enough that they can be retold and they should be retold in this format. I hope to be writing these for a long time.
Well, thanks, Ed. I really appreciate the time you took today to talk to us all about the Follow Your Fate series, specifically about the Wrath of Achilles. And all of us here at Bolchazy-Carducci Publishers do wish you the best of luck with the forthcoming titles.
Well, thanks, Andrew, and it was great talking with you, and I look forward to the books coming out. Thanks again.